My darlings, I see you, all of you. 5 signs tonight, and a financial door that none of you are going to see coming, because I am about to tell you exactly why it is built that way, and I want to start with the promise, before anything else, the way I always do when the promise is a large one. A financial door nobody saw coming opens for 5 zodiac signs tonight: Taurus, Capricorn, Virgo, Scorpio, and Leo, and I am ending with Leo, because Leo receives the strongest message in the whole of tonight's reading, and I would rather you knew that now than discovered it by accident at the very end. I want to be honest with you before I go any further, because I always am on this subject. I am not a financial advisor, and nothing tonight is financial advice. I do not know a specific number, and I am not going to invent one for the sake of a satisfying video. What I can show you is a structure, real and permanent in the chart, that describes precisely why this particular kind of money is so consistently missed by the people it is actually arriving for, and I think that structure is worth considerably more to you than a number I made up would ever be. I am Madame Aurora, 35 years studying the stars from my office in Manhattan, and let me tell you why this door is invisible to you until the moment it opens. Most money readings, including several I have given on this channel, talk about your second house. That is what you personally earn, your rate, your salary, the resources built directly by your own effort, alone. And I have given other readings about your 8th house, which is what merges with somebody else's resources through partnership, marriage, or transformation. Tonight is neither of those, and I want you to set both of them aside completely, because the door I am describing does not live in either place. It lives in your 11th house. The 11th house is not personal effort, and it is not intimate partnership. It is the house of the wider circle, of groups, associations, communities, the people you know without being close to, the acquaintance rather than the confidant, the loose network sitting at the edge of your attention rather than the center of it. And crucially, my darlings, it is the house that governs hopes, wishes, and unexpected gain, the one part of the chart specifically associated, since before this practice had a name for the outer planets, with benefit that arrives from an unanticipated direction. Here is why you have not seen it coming, and I want you to actually understand the mechanism rather than simply accept the promise. Your attention, when it comes to money, has almost certainly been trained on your second house and your 8th. What you earn directly, what merges with a partner's resources. Those are the 2 places you have been taught, correctly, to watch. Nobody taught you to watch your 11th house for money, because it does not usually behave like a financial house at all. It behaves like your social life, your hobbies, the loose, low-stakes corner of your world where nothing feels like it is actually at stake. Which is exactly why a door opening there catches you entirely by surprise. You were watching the front of the house, my darlings, the way you were taught to. This one opens around the side. Now let me show you the card, and I want to tell you why one is enough tonight. Because your instinct will be to want a full spread for a promise this size, and this particular subject does not actually need one. The card is the Ace of Pentacles. A single hand, emerging from a cloud, holding one large gold coin, upright, offered plainly toward whoever is looking at it. Below, a neat garden, flowers in careful rows, a hedge trimmed into an archway, and beyond the archway, a path leading toward distant hills. Aces, my darlings, are always the purest, least complicated form of their suit, the seed rather than the harvest, and pentacles are the suit of the material world, the tangible, the actually spendable. This is, as simply as tarot ever says anything, an opportunity, real, material, and just beginning. But look at where the hand is coming from, because it is the detail I most want you to keep tonight. It emerges from a cloud, not from a person you can name, not from an institution with a letterhead, or a source you could point to and say, there, that is where this is coming from. A cloud, my darlings, obscures. You cannot trace the hand back to an arm, a face, a specific identifiable origin, and I think that is precisely why this particular card belongs to tonight's reading, rather than any other. The door nobody saw coming very rarely announces its source clearly at the moment it opens. It offers the coin first, and the explanation, if it comes at all, comes considerably later, once you have already taken it. And now the garden, because it is the second half of the lesson. The coin is not the destination. It is the entrance to one. Behind it, a cultivated path, deliberately planted, leading through an archway toward hills you cannot yet see the far side of. My darlings, the hand is not handing you a finished fortune. It is handing you a seed and a gate, and the actual walking, the actual tending of what grows from it, is still entirely in front of you. I want you to release, right now, any picture you were holding of a single dramatic sum landing all at once, fully formed, requiring nothing further from you. That is not this card. This card is a beginning, offered from a source you may never fully identify, and the size of what eventually grows from it depends considerably on what you do with the seed once your hand actually closes around it. Now let me give you the 3 places this door most often opens, because knowing the house it lives in is not the same as knowing where to actually look, and I would rather give you something you can check against your own life this week than leave you simply waiting for a cloud to appear. The first is through somebody you have fallen out of touch with. Not a close friend you speak to weekly. Somebody further out, an old colleague, a person you knew well at a different point in your life and have not properly spoken to in a year or more. Your 11th house governs precisely this distance, and a considerable number of genuine financial doors arrive through exactly this kind of contact, resurfacing after a gap, because your 2nd house watches for effort and your 8th watches for intimacy, and neither of them is paying any attention to the acquaintance you have not messaged since last spring. The 2nd is through something you do for free. A hobby. An interest you have never once considered monetizing, because monetizing it would have felt like ruining the pleasure of it. My darlings, this is one of the most consistent patterns I have watched across 35 years, and it is precisely because the 11th house does not behave like a financial house that the thing which eventually pays you rarely arrives labeled as work in the first place. It arrives labeled as the thing you do on a Sunday because you enjoy it. And the 3rd is through a group or a community you belong to, loosely rather than centrally. Not your main employer, and not your family. A class, an association, an online group, a committee, something you attend or participate in without it occupying the center of your identity. The 11th house is the house of groups specifically, and a considerable number of financial doors this year are going to open through exactly this kind of loose affiliation, arriving from a direction none of tonight's 5 signs would ordinarily think to watch. Now let us begin. Let us go to Taurus. My darling Taurus, your 11th house is Pisces, ruled by Jupiter in the old tradition and Neptune in the new. And I want you to notice immediately how strange that pairing is for your sign specifically, because it is the strangest of all 5 tonight. Your own nature trusts the tangible. The thing you can hold, verify, and confirm before you commit to it. And your 11th house is governed by the least tangible sign in the entire zodiac, the one that operates on intuition, feeling, and a kind of compassionate imagination your sign does not naturally lead with when money is involved. So your door, my darling, is likely to arrive through something that does not feel like a financial opportunity at all when it first appears. A creative or spiritual interest, a charitable or compassionate connection, somebody you know through caring for something together rather than through any commercial context. A dream, quite literally, or a feeling about a direction that has no practical justification yet attached to it. Your instinct will be to dismiss it precisely because it cannot yet be verified, and I would ask you, just this once, to let the feeling sit a little longer before you require it to prove itself. I want to give you a practical version of that instruction, because your sign will otherwise hear it as an invitation to abandon judgment entirely, and that is not what I am asking. When the feeling arrives, write it down, plainly, on the day you have it, before you have had the chance to reason yourself out of it. Do not act on it immediately. Simply record it and return to it in a fortnight. If it still feels true once the initial pull has faded, you have your answer, and it will have earned that answer through time rather than through the kind of hard evidence your sign usually requires before it moves at all. Now let me speak to Capricorn. My darling Capricorn, your 11th house is Scorpio, ruled by Mars and, in modern practice, by Pluto, and I want to tell you why this is a genuinely intense placement for a house that is supposed to be your loosest, least central set of connections. Your sign guards its private self carefully, and the people who actually see the real you, rather than the composed, capable version you present everywhere else, are very few. Your 11th house governs the wider circle, the acquaintance rather than the intimate, and yet it is ruled by the sign of depth and transformation, which means your door is likely to open through somebody who has, unusually, allowed a glimpse of something real underneath your usual composure, even in a relationship you would not describe as close. For some of you, this is a person from a professional network who witnessed you at a genuinely difficult moment, rather than only your polished output, and who remembers that honesty specifically when an opportunity crosses her path. For some, it is a connection formed around something serious, a loss, a difficulty, a shared crisis, rather than anything social or casual. Do not discount the acquaintance who has seen you at your least composed, my darling. She is more likely than anybody else in your wider circle to be the one holding the coin. I want to name the reason this works, because I think it will help you actually trust it rather than simply take my word for it. Your sign is a superb judge of character, and you know, better than almost anyone, how rarely a person's true reliability is visible in ordinary, composed circumstances. Anyone can seem trustworthy at a dinner party. What you learned about this particular acquaintance, in whatever difficult moment she witnessed, is considerably harder won and considerably more accurate, and she has been carrying that same accurate impression of you ever since, waiting, without necessarily knowing it, for an occasion to act on it. Now, before I go to Virgo, let me pause for a moment. If what I have said so far is landing, tap that little like button below this video. It is a small gesture and it does something real, which is tell YouTube to carry this to somebody who has been staring straight at her second house, waiting for a raise, while an entirely different door has been quietly ajar around the side the whole time. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment, because 3 signs remain, and Leo's is the strongest message in the entire reading. Now let me speak to Virgo. My darling Virgo, your 11th house is Cancer, ruled by the moon, and I think this one is going to feel, once I describe it, considerably more obvious in hindsight than it does right now, because your sign has almost certainly already been doing the thing that opens this door for some time, without recognizing it as one. Cancer governs care, nurturing, the quiet, unglamorous tending of people who need looking after, and your 11th house being ruled by it means your door opens through service you provide, freely, within a community, rather than through anything you have ever billed for, not your job. Something adjacent to it, or entirely separate from it, where you have quietly become the person a particular group relies on. For some of you, this is a parenting group, a caregiving circle, a community organized around looking after people who need it, where your competence has been noticed by somebody with the means to actually pay for it properly. For some, it is simply that the reliable, patient service you have been providing without charge, for years, in some corner of your life, finally intersects with somebody who has both the need and the resources to make it worth your while. Your sign undervalues this kind of work consistently, my darling, because it does not resemble your paid work in either form or feeling. I would ask you to look at exactly the corner of your life where you already give the most, and consider it, seriously, as the most likely site of tonight's door. Now let me speak to Scorpio. My darling Scorpio, your 11th house is Virgo, ruled by Mercury, and I want to tell you why this is, in its own way, the most precise placement of tonight's 5. Your sign has a skill, somewhere, that you have quietly perfected over years without ever properly monetizing it. Not your main professional competence, which you have very likely already priced correctly. Something adjacent, a specific, detailed, unglamorous capability, the kind of thing your sign does thoroughly and privately, because doing it thoroughly is simply how you do anything, rather than because you ever intended to sell it. Your door opens through somebody noticing that skill specifically, in a context that has nothing to do with your main work, and asking, plainly, whether you would be willing to apply it to something they need. For some of you, this arrives through a loose professional association, somebody in a group you barely participate in actively, who has watched you handle something with precision and remembered it. Your sign's instinct, my darling, is to be suspicious of an opportunity that arrives through a connection you do not consider close, because your nature trusts depth over breadth, and I would ask you, for this particular door, to set that instinct aside. This one is not going to arrive from somebody who has earned deep trust. It is going to arrive from somebody who simply noticed something true. And now let me speak to Leo, and I have saved you for last, because I promised you, This is the strongest message in tonight's reading, and I meant it. My darling Leo, your 11th house is Gemini, ruled by Mercury, and I want you to sit with the specific shape of this, because it corrects something your sign has very likely been getting slightly wrong about how this particular door works. Your natural instinct, when you imagine an opportunity finding you, involves being seen. The room turning toward you, your presence doing the work it usually does. But your 11th house is ruled by Mercury, the planet of the word rather than the spotlight, and it governs your wider social circle, specifically through conversation, information passed casually between people, rather than through anybody being dazzled by you directly. Your door, my darling, is going to open through something said, almost in passing, within a group you are part of but not necessarily the center of. A conversation you were not the loudest voice in. A piece of information mentioned casually by somebody in your wider circle that turns out to matter considerably more than it seemed to at the time it was said. I want to prepare you for how unglamorous this is going to feel, because your sign is accustomed to opportunity arriving with some ceremony attached, and this one will not. It will sound, at first, like ordinary conversation, the kind you have a dozen times a week, and the tell will not be how it was delivered. It will be what happens if you actually follow up on it, rather than letting it pass as pleasant small talk. Now, my darlings, let me speak to the 7 signs I have not named tonight, because every chart has an 11th house, and I do not believe in a reading that gives 5 of you the whole of my attention and leaves everybody else standing outside. Aries, your 11th house is Aquarius. Your money door opens through a genuinely unconventional group, something that does not resemble any network you would ordinarily consider useful. Gemini, your 11th house is Libra. Your door opens through a pairing, 2 people introducing you to each other, rather than through either one alone. Cancer, your 11th house is Leo. Your door opens through somebody in your wider circle who is unusually generous with introductions and credit, and who mentions you, favorably, in a room you are not in. Libra, your 11th house is Sagittarius. Your door opens through distance. Somebody from another place or another field entirely, reaching in from outside your usual world. Sagittarius, your 11th house is Capricorn. Your door opens through structure, a formal association or professional body you belong to, more out of obligation than enthusiasm. Aquarius, your 11th house is your own sign, which makes this the most direct placement in the whole chart, and your door opens through the loose networks you already, naturally, spend the most time inside. And Pisces, your 11th house is Aries. Your door opens quickly, through somebody who acts on your behalf before you have even finished deciding whether to act yourself. Every one of you has a door somewhere in this 11th house, my darlings, whether or not your sign was one of tonight's 5. Now, before I go further, do something with me. It takes 20 seconds and it works whatever your sign. Think of somebody you have not properly spoken to in over a year. Not a close friend. An acquaintance, an old colleague, somebody from a chapter of your life that has closed. Let one name actually come to mind, rather than dismissing the exercise before it starts. Now think of one thing you do purely for enjoyment, that you have never once considered charging for. Hold both. I am going to come back to them. Now let me tell you about Cornelia. Cornelia was a Virgo client of mine, born in early September, who came to me some years ago about a parenting group she had belonged to for nearly 6 years. She had joined it when her own children were small, purely for the company and the practical support of other parents in a similar situation, and had, over the following years, become the person in that group everyone quietly relied on. She organized the rota when somebody was ill. She researched things thoroughly when a question came up that nobody else had time to properly investigate. She was, by her own rather modest description, simply useful, in the unremarkable way a person becomes useful to a community over a long stretch of ordinary participation. One of the other mothers in that group ran a small but genuinely successful business, entirely unrelated to parenting, and had watched Cornelia's quiet, thorough competence for years, without ever having an occasion to actually use it professionally. When her business reached a point where she needed exactly Cornelia's particular skill set, meticulous research and careful, patient organization, she thought of Cornelia immediately, and offered her paid work before Cornelia had any idea the offer was coming. Cornelia told me she was genuinely astonished. Not because the work itself was unusual for her, she had been doing some version of it for free for 6 years, but because it had never once occurred to her that anybody was watching her do it, with an eye toward what it might be worth. I asked her what she thought had made the difference, why this particular woman, out of a group of perhaps 30 parents, had been the one to notice. She said, "I do not think anybody else was actually paying attention the way she was. I was not performing for an audience. I was just being useful because that is what I do. I think that is precisely why it worked." She was not hiring a performance. She had watched the real thing, for years, before she ever needed it. My darling Virgos, that is the whole of tonight's lesson from Cornelia's own account. The door did not open because she made herself visible. It opened because she was, quietly, consistently, exactly herself, for long enough that somebody with the means to notice eventually did. Now, before I go on, let me pause for a moment. If Cornelia's story landed somewhere true, if you recognize the corner of your own life where you have been quietly, consistently useful without ever pricing it, tap that little like button below this video. It is the simplest way to tell YouTube to carry this to somebody who has been performing for the wrong audience, while the real one has been watching all along. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because I make these readings for every sign, and I make them so they can be found whenever somebody needs them, rather than only during a particular week. Wait. Before I continue, I need to interrupt myself, because I want to address something directly, rather than letting it sit unaddressed underneath a reading about money arriving from an unclear source. The hand in tonight's card comes from a cloud, and I told you that means you may never fully identify where a genuine opportunity originates. I want to be extremely careful that you do not hear that as permission to stop asking questions of something that presents itself as money from an unclear source, because there is a considerable difference between the two, and I would be doing you real harm if I blurt it for the sake of a tidy metaphor. A genuine 11th house door, in my experience, always traces back to an actual person you can name, even if you did not immediately recognize them as the source. The old colleague, the parent from the group, the acquaintance in the association you barely attend. The cloud in the card obscures the connection from your view in the moment it happens, not from reality itself. If you sit with it for a day, you will always be able to say, "This came from her," or "from that group," or "through that specific person," even if you did not see it coming. What I am not describing tonight, and what I want you to be genuinely careful of, is money that arrives from an actual stranger, with no traceable connection at all, particularly if it asks anything of you first. A payment up front. Personal or financial details before any real relationship exists. Pressure to decide quickly, before you have had time to verify who is actually asking. That is not an 11th house door, my darlings. Whatever it calls itself. That is the oldest trick this particular subject has, dressed up in exactly the language I have been using tonight, because it works precisely by borrowing the shape of a genuine surprise. If you cannot eventually name a real person behind it, and if it asks you to move quickly and pay something before it delivers anything, walk away from it entirely, and do not let anything I have said this evening talk you out of that instinct. Now let me tell you the other kind of story, because I have told you the one where the connection was clear. Isadora was a Scorpio client of mine who came to me sometime after the events she wanted to discuss, and I want to tell her story carefully, because it is not a story about a door missed entirely. It is a story about a door nearly missed, and I think the nearly is the useful part. She had a genuinely rare, highly specific technical skill, developed over about 15 years in a fairly narrow professional field, which she had priced correctly within that field, and never once considered applying anywhere else. She belonged, loosely, to an online group connected to an entirely unrelated interest of hers, something she had joined years earlier purely for enjoyment and had never used professionally in any way. Somebody in that group, whom Isadora had exchanged perhaps a dozen messages with over several years, reached out one evening with a request. She was working on a project in a field adjacent to Isadora's actual expertise, and wondered whether Isadora would be willing to consult on one specific, technical piece of it, for proper payment. Isadora's first instinct, she told me, was suspicion. Not of the person specifically, but of the whole shape of the offer. It had arrived from somebody she did not know well, through a group that had nothing to do with her actual profession, proposing paid work in a context that did not resemble how paid work had ever arrived for her before. She told me she very nearly declined it outright, assuming, without fully examining the assumption, that anything this unusual in its origin was more likely to be a waste of her time than a genuine opportunity. She asked a few careful questions first, which I want to be clear was entirely the correct instinct, and the answers held up. The person was real, verifiably connected to a real project, entirely willing to discuss terms plainly, and to be paid in the ordinary way rather than anything irregular. Isadora took the work. It became, over the following 2 years, a genuinely significant addition to her professional life, an entirely new direction she would never have found through her existing professional network, because her existing professional network had no reason to ever connect her to that particular field. She told me, reflecting on it afterward, that she had come within, in her own words, about one evening's hesitation of declining the message outright. She said, "I nearly said no because it did not look like how good things are supposed to arrive for me. I have spent 15 years building a reputation in one specific world, and I think some part of me had decided that anything genuinely valuable had to come from inside that world, through channels I already recognized. It did not occur to me, until I actually sat with the offer, that a door could be real simply because I had checked it properly, rather than because it looked like every other door I had ever walked through before." My darling Scorpios, that is the caution I most want you to take from tonight's reading. Verify, always, exactly as Isadora did, but do not let the unfamiliar shape of an opportunity be the reason you decline it before you have actually checked whether it is real. Pause with me for a moment. I know this has been a great deal. If this reading is bringing you something tonight, would you do me 3 small things? Like this video. It tells YouTube this matters to real people, and it carries it to somebody who is about to decline a genuine opportunity because it did not arrive through a familiar channel. Subscribe and turn on the bell if you have not, because I make these readings for every sign, and I intend to keep making them. And write to me in the comments, and I want the specific thing rather than the general thing. Tell me your sign, and tell me one thing you do purely for enjoyment that you have never once considered charging for. That is the whole of it. Not the plan, not the story, simply the thing. And if you have been here a while, membership on this channel means readings reach you before they are published, and it means you and I actually speak in the comments, because I read member comments first, and I answer there more often and more personally than I am able to anywhere else. Now let me give you the practical part, because a structure is not a method, and I would rather leave you with something to actually do this week. There are 4 things. The first, go back to the 2 things I asked you to hold earlier. The name of somebody you have not properly spoken to in over a year, and the thing you do purely for enjoyment. Send one message to the person, this week, with no agenda attached beyond genuine reconnection, not a pitch. Simply a hello. Doors in the 11th house very rarely open to people who never re-establish contact with the wider circle in the first place. The second, take an honest inventory of your loose affiliations, the groups, classes, and associations you belong to without being central to them, and ask yourself, plainly, what skill or quality you bring to each one that you have never once considered valuable. Cornelia had been answering that question with her actions for 6 years without ever asking it out loud. The third, when something unusual arrives, verify it properly before you decide anything about it, exactly the way Isadora did. Ask who the person actually is. Confirm the project is real. Discuss terms plainly. In the ordinary way, any legitimate arrangement is discussed. And once it has genuinely checked out, do not let its unfamiliar shape be the reason you decline it, the way Isadora very nearly did. And the fourth, notice, this week specifically, any piece of information that arrives casually, in conversation, within a group you belong to loosely rather than centrally. Your sign is not accustomed to watching that particular channel for anything of consequence, which is precisely why I am asking you to watch it now, deliberately, for the next several weeks, rather than waiting for it to announce itself the way your 2nd house and 8th house opportunities usually do. Let me speak briefly to where this door tends to actually arrive, because the 11th house shows up differently depending on which corner of your life it enters through. In your professional life, but adjacent to it rather than inside it, this most often looks like Isadora's story, a skill developed in one field finding an entirely unexpected application in another, through a connection that has nothing to do with your actual industry. Keep at least one foot in a world unrelated to your main work, my darlings, even if it never once seems relevant to your income. You very rarely know in advance which unrelated world is going to turn out to matter. In community and volunteer work, this most often looks like Cornelia's story, quiet, consistent usefulness noticed over years by somebody who eventually has both the need and the means to properly value it. This is the gentlest version of tonight's door, and also the slowest, and I would ask you not to rush it or perform for it, because the whole reason it worked for Cornelia is that she was never performing at all. In old friendships and past professional relationships, this is the door that opens through simple reconnection. A message sent for no reason beyond genuine warmth, that happens to land at exactly the moment the other person has something to offer. You cannot manufacture this timing, my darlings, but you can make yourself findable by it, which is the whole of what sending that one message this week is actually for. And in your own private interests, the hobbies and enthusiasms you have always kept separate from anything financial, this is the door that asks the most of you internally, because it requires you to consider, seriously, that something you do purely for love might also be worth something to somebody else, without that possibility diminishing the love itself. Now let me give you the ritual, and it is practical rather than ceremonial, because tonight's subject rewards an actual list more than it rewards atmosphere. Find 20 minutes, somewhere you will not be interrupted. A green candle if you like one, for growth and material things, and if you have none, my darling, it changes nothing at all, because the object was never the mechanism. Take a piece of paper and draw 3 columns. In the first column, list every group, class, association, or loose community you currently belong to, however minor. Do not skip the ones that feel too small or too casual to matter. That feeling is precisely the disguise I described at the very beginning of this reading. In the second column, next to each one, write one specific skill, quality, or piece of knowledge you bring to that group that nobody there is currently paying you for. And in the third column, write one name, a specific person within that group who might plausibly need exactly what you wrote in the second column, whether or not you believe they currently have any reason to think of you that way. When the list is finished, choose one row. Not the most promising one, necessarily. Simply one you can act on this week. And then do the smallest possible version of reaching toward it. Not a proposal, not a pitch. A message, a comment. A small act of genuine presence in that group that puts you back in view of the person in the third column, in an entirely ordinary way that asks nothing of them at all. Keep the page, my darlings, and add to it whenever a new group or a new skill occurs to you. This is not a document you finish once. It is the map of your own 11th house, and the door I have promised you tonight is somewhere on it, in a row you have not fully appreciated yet. Now, my darlings, let me give you the thing I have been building toward the whole of this hour. Do you remember the card? A single hand from a cloud offering 1 coin. Behind it, a cultivated garden, a hedge trimmed into an archway, a path leading toward hills you cannot yet see over. I told you the coin was not the destination. I want to give you the full weight of that now, because I think it is the actual reason so many people, having received exactly the kind of door I have described tonight, still end up feeling, some months later, that nothing much came of it. They took the coin, my darlings, and then they stood there, in the garden, admiring it, waiting for the rest to arrive on its own. The Ace of Pentacles is not a card about winning. It is a card about a beginning, and I want to be precise about what that actually requires of you, because your sign, whichever of tonight's 5 you are, has spent a lifetime being extremely good at effort, applied where the effort is visible and expected. Your second housework, your professional competence, the things you already know how to labor at properly. This door does not ask for that kind of effort at first. It asks for something smaller and, in its own way, more difficult, which is recognition. Noticing the hand when it appears, in a place you were not trained to watch, offered by a source you cannot immediately name, in a form that does not resemble any opportunity you have been taught to take seriously. And then, Once you have recognized it and taken the coin, it asks for the walking. The actual, unglamorous, continued tending of whatever grows from that first small beginning, through the archway, along the path, toward hills that were never visible from where the hand first appeared. Cornelia's door did not end with the first paid project. Isadora's did not end with the first consultation. Both of those became, over subsequent months and years, something considerably larger than the initial coin, precisely because neither woman stood in the garden admiring the gold. Both of them, once they had it in hand, simply kept walking. I want to say one more thing about the cloud, because I think it is the most freeing part of tonight's entire reading. You are very likely never going to fully understand why this particular door opened for you, at this particular moment, through this particular unlikely connection. There will not always be a clean, satisfying explanation available, a reason you can point to and say, "Ah, that is why it was me. That is why it was now." Some of it will simply remain obscured, the way the arm behind that hand always remains obscured, disappearing into cloud just above the wrist. My darlings, you do not need to solve that mystery in order to take the coin. You only need to recognize the hand, reach for it, and be willing to walk the path that follows, without requiring the whole of the explanation before you are willing to take the first step of it. And I want to leave you with one last thought about the hills in that image, the ones visible past the archway, at the far end of the garden path. You cannot see over them from where the hand first appears. Nobody can, at the beginning of anything. That is not a flaw in the card, and it is not a flaw in your own situation when this door finally opens for you. It is simply what a beginning actually is, and every single harvest anybody has ever gathered from an Ace of Pentacles started exactly there, at an archway, looking at hills whose far side was not yet visible, and walked forward anyway. My darlings, before I let you go, 3 small things. 1. If any part of this reading found you tonight, if you recognized your own unpaid skill in one of tonight's 5, if Cornelia's parenting group or Isadora's one evening of hesitation landed somewhere real, tap that like button. It is the simplest way to tell YouTube to carry this to somebody who has been watching the wrong door entirely. 2. Subscribe and turn on the bell. I make these readings for every sign, and I make them so they can be found whenever somebody needs them, rather than only during a particular week. If you become a member, readings reach you before they are published, and you and I actually speak in the comments, because I read member comments first. 3, and this is the one I care about most. The thing you do for enjoyment. Just the thing. Not the plan attached to it, simply what it is. I read every single comment, truly, and I want to tell you why I am asking for that, rather than a prediction of what is coming. Because a comment section full of 40 women, each naming the thing she does purely for love, is a room full of people quietly mapping their own 11th house in public, and any one of you scrolling through it may recognize, in somebody else's answer, the exact shape of a door you had never once thought to look for in your own life. And if this reading gave you something and you ever want to say thank you more directly, a super thanks is never expected and always felt, and it is a genuine part of how I keep making these readings as carefully as I make them. If you know somebody who has a rare, unpriced skill sitting quietly inside a hobby she has never once considered valuable, send this to her tonight. You may not realize how much a single share matters. It is how this work finds the person who needs it. Thank you, my darlings. This community has become something I genuinely did not expect when I began. A financial door nobody saw coming opens for 5 zodiac signs. That is the title, and I want to close by telling you exactly what I mean by it, because it is not entirely what you thought when this hour began. It does not mean a fortune arrives, complete and unearned, from a source you will never have to think about again. It means a coin, offered from a cloud, at the entrance to a garden you have not yet walked through, and the size of what eventually grows from it depends considerably on whether you recognize the hand when it appears. Taurus, through a feeling that has no proof attached to it yet. Capricorn, through the one person who has actually seen you unguarded. Virgo, through the corner of your life where you already give the most. Scorpio, through the unfamiliar shape you very nearly declined. And Leo, my darling, through the ordinary conversation you almost let pass as nothing but small talk. The door is not going to knock loudly, my darlings. It rarely does, in my experience, for any of the 11th house's quiet arrivals. It is simply going to be there, some ordinary week, a hand extended from somewhere you cannot quite see, holding one coin, waiting to find out whether you were paying attention to the side of the house nobody taught you to watch. I am Madame Aurora from Manhattan, and I love you, all 12 signs of the Zodiac. I will see you in the next reading.